Researchers studying ancient fire pits have found human fingernails embedded in the ash, not from the dead, but from people who were still alive when they left them there. Nobody knows why. The leading theory is that they were offerings. The darker theory is that they were warnings. There is something about a campfire that unlocks the oldest parts of us. Long before electricity, before walls, before locks on doors, we gathered around fire not just for warmth, but for protection. Because in the dark beyond those flames, something always watched. We knew it. Our ancestors knew it. They built their stories around it, passed them down, encoded every warning they had into tales told low and close while the logs crackled and the shadows moved. Tonight, I want you to understand why those stories mattered, because the fears they carried were never imaginary. The deepest dread in any campfire story is never the monster you can see. It lives in the familiar, made wrong, a laugh that sounds almost like yours, a face that almost belongs to someone you love. The old tales understood this perfectly. They didn't scare you with creatures that came from nowhere. They scared you with the idea that the people seated beside you around that very fire might not be who you believed them to be. That at some point in the night, something slipped in and made itself comfortable in the shape of your friend, your spouse, your child. And the worst part, the part that made those stories stick, was this: you would never know. Not until the fire burned too low to see by. Not until it was already far too late. And in 1987, a family of 5 camped at a place called Hollow Creek. The youngest daughter, age 4, kept pointing past the tree line and saying her grandfather was standing there, waving at her. Her grandfather had died 6 months before. The parents assumed it was grief playing tricks on a small mind. They did not investigate. By morning, 3 of the 5 were gone. No struggle, no screams, no sign of anything forced. Just footprints in the soft mud leading into the woods and then leading back. The footprints going in belonged to shoes. The footprints coming back were bare. The 2 who remained were found near the dead fire, sitting upright and silent, staring at nothing. Neither ever spoke about that night. Both were buried before their 40th birthdays, cause of death listed simply as cardiac arrest, though every doctor who examined them privately noted that their hearts showed no abnormalities. They had simply, in the words of one physician, decided to stop. The old rule from nearly every wilderness tradition is the same. If you hear a voice you recognize calling your name from the dark beyond the fire, do not answer. Do not stand. Do not look. Because whatever is calling you has been watching long enough to know exactly which voice will make you move. It has done the work. It has learned you. And it is patient in the way that only very old things can afford to be patient. The worst account I have ever encountered came from a park ranger in Montana who found a man alone at a cold campsite, unresponsive, eyes open, staring at dead ash. When paramedics arrived, the man's gaze kept tracking something circling the clearing that no one else could see. He was transported, assessed, physically unharmed. He never spoke again. But he drew, every single day, on whatever surface he could reach, the same image repeated obsessively. A campfire, 4 people seated around it, and behind each person, pressed close over their shoulder, another figure identical to the one in front of it, smiling. When he died, the staff counted the drawings, 4,712. In every single one, without exception, the figures behind wore the same expression: open, warm, patient, the kind of smile that wants something from you. The campfire gives light, but it also makes shadows, and those shadows move in ways the light cannot fully explain. Something has always lived in the space between where the fire ends and the dark begins. Something that has had a very long time to study us, to learn what we love, to practice the faces of the people we trust most. It is not cruel. That is the most unsettling part. It is simply hungry. And tonight, while you sit wherever you are listening to this, I want you to ask yourself one quiet question. The person closest to you right now. When did you last really look at them? I mean, truly look. Past the familiar, past the comfort, all the way into the eyes. Because the fire is burning low, and the shadows behind you are very, very still. Scientists studying sleep paralysis across 37 countries, hundreds of years of recorded accounts, and dozens of distinct cultural traditions have found one detail that does not change. The figure standing over the bed is always smiling. Every culture, every continent, every century. The same smile, described in the same words, by people who have never met and never could have compared notes. Nobody has been able to explain why the expression is always identical. The leading hypothesis is that we are all seeing the same thing. The campfire tale is an act of intimacy. We lean in together. We feel the heat on our faces and the cold at our backs, and in that narrow space between firelight and forest, between what we can see and what we cannot, the story does something nothing else can manage. It makes the fear yours. It takes the dark and gives it a face. Tonight, the face it gives the dark is one you may already know. Because this story is not about a monster. It is about a mirror that has learned to smile back. Across every culture that has ever told horror stories around a fire, one image returns without fail. The wrong smile. Too wide, too fixed, too present in a face that has no reason to be glad. Our brains are wired from birth to read the human face, and when something is almost right, when it is close enough to human to pass a first glance, but fractionally, incorrectly, permanently off, something ancient and animal inside us does not just feel afraid. It screams. The old stories named this creature many things: a fetch, a doppelganger, a revenant, a hollow twin. But the descriptions across every tradition share one consistent feature. It wore a human face, it moved like a human being, and it smiled in situations where no human being would ever think to. Especially in situations where no human being would ever think to. A family in rural Oregon began noticing that their youngest son would wake at the same time each night, 3:33, walk silently to the kitchen window, and stand there for exactly 11 minutes before returning to bed with no memory of having moved. One night the mother followed him. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him stand at the glass. After a few moments, he smiled. That slow, too wide smile that belonged to nothing she had raised. She stepped forward to touch his shoulder. From upstairs, from his bedroom, her son called out, "Mom, who are you talking to?" She turned back to the window. The thing standing at the glass was still smiling, but now it was looking directly at her. Not at the window, at her. It raised one hand and placed a single finger to its lips. She sealed every window in that house with black tape the following morning. She left every light on through every night until the day they moved. She never explained any of it to her son. Some things, she understood, cannot be explained without making them more real. There is a grief counselor who told me the worst version of this story. She had been seeing a patient, a woman in her 40s who had lost her husband the year before. The woman arrived one session looking lighter, relieved, more present than she had been in months. She said her husband had come back. She said he sat at the foot of her bed each night and smiled at her. And that smile made her feel as though nothing bad could ever touch her again. She said it was the most comforting thing she had ever seen in her life. The counselor asked her to describe the smile. The woman's face went very still. She said, "You know, it never quite reaches his eyes. But I have decided I do not mind." That was her last session. The counselor drove past her house 2 weeks later. Every curtain was drawn. A neighbor mentioned that the woman no longer came outside. But some nights, in one window, there was a silhouette, standing perfectly still, facing out. When the counselor looked carefully, she saw that there were 2 of them. The smile is the oldest mask in the world. And whatever has been watching us, studying us across centuries, learning our faces, perfecting our expressions, has had an extraordinary amount of time to practice. It has gotten very good. The only way you would ever know is in the eyes. The smile is perfect now. The eyes are still learning. Look carefully tonight at the faces you love most and ask yourself, are the eyes keeping up? In 2003, a distress signal was received by a search and rescue relay station in the Pacific Northwest. The voice on the recording identified itself by name, gave precise coordinates, and pleaded for immediate assistance. The signal repeated on a loop for 6 hours before it was traced. The problem was this. The hiker it belonged to had been found dead 11 days earlier, 40 miles away from the coordinates in the recording. The case was quietly closed. The recording was never released to the public. The man who first heard it requested early retirement 2 weeks later and has not spoken about it since. Campfire stories are the original warning system. Before maps, before satellites, before any device that fits in your pocket, travelers gathered around fire and shared what they had seen so that others would not follow them into the dark. Every story was a data point. Every story kept someone alive. Tonight's warning is about what happens when the tools we trust most become the thing that finds us. When the voice in the static already knows your name before you say a word. We trust our technology with our lives in the wilderness. A charged phone, an emergency radio, a satellite locator. These things feel like a hand extended in the dark. But isolation has a way of warping signals, bending frequencies, and in places where enough people have suffered and died, it seems as though the very atmosphere has absorbed something, has learned, has practiced. The every experienced backcountry guide carries one rule that nobody prints in any manual. If you hear your own voice coming out of your radio, turn it off immediately. Do not respond. Do not try to understand it. Because whatever has learned to copy you is not calling for help. It is calling you closer. And it has been rehearsing your voice long enough to get it exactly right. A group of 4 hikers in the Cascades began picking up a voice on their emergency radio on their second night out. A woman, calm and specific, addressing each of them by their first names, asking them to follow her voice north. They knew no woman on the trail. The voice knew the model of tent they had pitched. It knew what they had eaten for dinner. It knew things that had not been said aloud. And when the youngest member of the group picked up the handset and asked who was speaking, the frequency went silent for 11 seconds. Then, slowly and clearly, it said his mother's name. He stepped out of camp at 2 in the morning. His companions found him 3 miles north, seated on a boulder, physically unharmed, completely still. When they reached him and touched his shoulder, he turned and said 4 words. She wants you too. He has no memory of that night. He still checks his radio every evening before he sleeps. He has never said why. The most documented version of this phenomenon involves a weather station operator named Elise, who spent 3 months alone at a remote outpost in northern Canada. Her logs are public record. The first month is entirely routine. The second month, she begins noting a frequency that appears every night at exactly 3:17 in the morning. She describes it initially as breathing. By week 9, she has started responding to it. Her entries grow shorter and further apart. In the final weeks, she writes only fragments. It knows the silences between my words. It sounds like it is learning how rooms feel. It sounds like it is getting closer, and I don't know how to explain what I mean by that. Her final log entry reads, "It told me my name tonight. Not the name anyone calls me. My real name, the one I have never spoken to anyone. I do not know how it could know that. I do not know how to keep it out. The static sounds like it is in the room now. It sounds like it is right behind me, and I am too afraid to..." The entry ends there. Elise was found 3 weeks later, sitting at her desk, headphones on, expression peaceful. The radio was not plugged in. The power to the entire station had been cut for 19 days. Somewhere in the dead frequencies, in the white noise between channels, in the hiss that your device makes when it has nothing left to receive, something is listening. It has been there long enough to learn the exact shape of your voice, the specific rhythm of your breathing, the precise word that would make you open the door and step outside. One night, in a place far from anyone who would hear you answer back, it is going to use everything it has learned. The only question is whether you will recognize what is calling before you are already walking toward it. Every year, more than 1,600 people vanish inside America's national parks. Most are found. A few are not. But there is a training protocol, informal and unwritten, passed between park rangers from generation to generation, that covers the ones who do come back. The protocol is simple and contains only one instruction: do not ask them where they went. Because the answers, according to every ranger who has ever ignored that rule, are always the same. And they are always wrong in exactly the same way. Before ghost stories, before named demons, before every creature we ever gave a title and a legend, there were the woods, ancient and indifferent and vast beyond any human reckoning. The campfire was our first real act of defiance against them. That circle of light was humanity saying, "We are here, we are together, Marson, we will not be taken tonight." The fire held the dark back, but it could not hold back everything. Because some things do not come from outside the circle. Some things were already inside when you lit the match. Folklore from virtually every indigenous tradition on Earth carries the same specific warning. There are places in the deep forest where you do not walk, not because of animals, not because of difficult terrain, because something that exists in those places will follow you home, and it will not follow you on the outside. It will follow you on the inside. The elders did not call it possession, because that word implies something forcing its way in against resistance. They called it replacement. Slow and quiet, and so precisely done that by the time anyone noticed, the person who had entered the forest was already gone, and what stood in their place had been given enough time to learn the walk, the voice, the habits, the history, to become indistinguishable from the person it had replaced to everyone except the people who loved them most deeply. And even they, eventually, began to doubt what they felt. A logging crew working in British Columbia in 1961 refused to enter a quarter-mile section of old-growth forest. Not one worker. 53 men from different towns, different backgrounds, who had never worked together before, and every single one of them stopped at the same invisible boundary and said the same thing. The silence changed. Not that it got quieter, that the silence became different in quality, active. They said it felt aware. The foreman entered alone to prove a point. He emerged 40 minutes later, cooperative and calm, and then returned to work without a word about what he had seen. 3 days later, his crew noticed that he had stopped blinking entirely. They watched him for 2 full hours. He never once blinked. When they pointed it out, he smiled slowly and said, "I don't think I need to anymore." The story that ended careers at the Forest Service began with a 7-year-old girl who wandered from a campsite in the Appalachian high country. Search teams found her 4 days later, unharmed, well-nourished, dry despite 3 consecutive days of heavy rain. During the psychological assessment, she was calm, articulate, and completely cooperative. She said the forest had taken care of her. She said it had spoken to her, filled her with something warm, something that felt like being completely and permanently known. And the examining psychologist noted one anomaly in the report. The child had been left-handed her entire life. She was now using her right hand exclusively and showed no awareness of having changed. When the psychologist gently raised the point, the girl tilted her head too slowly, the way a recording sounds when the playback speed drops, and said, "She was left-handed. I think I will try something different." The psychologist resigned the following Monday. The girl is grown now. By all accounts, she is warm, successful, well-liked. People who knew her before the disappearance say she is perfectly normal. Her mother, still alive, still coherent, still sharp, refuses to be in the same room as her daughter. She will not explain herself in detail. She only ever says, "That is not my child. It has never been my child." And I knew it the moment she walked out of the trees, because she walked out smiling, and my daughter was afraid of the dark. The fire keeps the forest back, but it cannot reclaim what the forest has already decided to keep. Some things return from the woods wearing human lives like a coat borrowed without asking. And they are very, very good at the fit. In survival psychology, there is a documented phenomenon called the lure of light. Lost hikers, disoriented and desperate, will walk toward any illuminated window regardless of where it leads, regardless of what they glimpse through the glass, regardless of every instinct telling them something is not right. They walk toward it anyway. Researchers say it is because the human brain, when sufficiently frightened and exhausted, simply cannot override the deep-coded equation. Light equals people equals safety. The equation is usually correct. That is what makes the exceptions so catastrophic. The Campfire story has always been, underneath everything else, a survival manual. Every tale passed around a fire at night was a warning dressed as entertainment. Don't enter the cave. Don't cross the water alone. Grise, don't follow the sound of a child crying in the dark, because no child should be out there. Every horror we encoded into story existed because the thing it described was real enough that someone had survived it and needed to pass the information forward. This story is one of those warnings. It is old, and it has been told in different forms for as long as people have traveled in wilderness, and it has never stopped being relevant. Please carry it with you. The most dangerous thing in any wilderness is not predators, not weather, not terrain. It is false hope, a trail that looks like the right one but bends the wrong direction, a landmark that looks familiar from a different angle than it should. And worst of all, most deadly of all, a light in the absolute dark that looks exactly like rescue. We are wired to move toward it, and we cannot help it. And whatever has learned to hunt us figured this out long before we named it a threat. The old stories described it consistently across cultures. A cottage in the woods with warm light in the window. A door that opens before you knock. A voice that says, come in, you must be so cold," without ever asking who you are or how you found the place. Because it already knows. It always already knows. 3 university students were hiking the Ozarks in 2008 when a late storm cut visibility to nothing. They spotted a house through the trees, lights on, smoke rising from the chimney, completely absent from any map any of them had consulted. They debated for several minutes. They decided the warmth was worth the uncertainty. The door opened before the first knock landed. The interior was warm, clean, and so completely ordinary that the strangeness of finding it there receded almost immediately. An elderly woman offered them soup. She used their first names. They assumed she had heard them talking on the path. She showed them to separate rooms. They were asleep within minutes. In the morning, they were lying on bare concrete in a structure that had been derelict for at least 30 years. Walls collapsed inward. Roof partially gone, no fireplace, no kitchen, no evidence of habitation in decades. They were in sleeping bags none of them owned. One of them checked her phone. There were 47 missed calls, all from family, spread across what appeared to be 11 months. The calls had begun the night they went in. They had been inside that house for one night. 11 months had passed outside it. The oldest written account of this place comes from a collection of Appalachian knowledge compiled in 1923 by a woman named Covenant, who spent 97 years in those mountains and wrote down everything she knew before she died. She described a structure that appeared between 2 villages only in winter, only to people traveling alone, only after dark. Everyone who entered it came back found and physically whole. But they were never hungry again. Not once. Not ever. No matter how little they ate or how long they went without food. They reported no hunger whatsoever. And their families, lying awake at night in the rooms beside them, would sometimes hear them murmur in their sleep. Always the same phrase, low and rhythmic, in and out like a tide. Almost full, almost full, almost full. Covenant's final entry in the collection is one sentence. My husband found that house in 1887. I have lived with him for 51 years since. I have watched him eat. I have held his hand. I do not know what I have been living with, but it loves me. I am almost certain of that. When you are lost and cold and the dark is total and you see a light ahead, warm, steady, patient, remember this story. Remember that some things glow because they are burning, and some things glow because they have learned that you will always, always come.